3 men died on Christmas Eve and were met by Peter at the pearly gates, so you can tell already that this is a real story, right? In honor of this holy season, Peter said, you must each possess something that symbolizes Christmas to get into heaven. Yeah, we knew that was the regulation there too in the Christmas season. So the first man fumbled through his pockets and pulled out a lighter. He flicked it on. It represents a candle, he said. You may pass through the pearly gates, Peter said. The second man reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He shook them, and he says, they're bells. So Peter said, you may pass through the pearly gates. The third man started searching through his pockets desperately, looking for something that he could offer that would show forth Christmas. Finally, he brought out a pair of women's glasses. Peter raised up an eyebrow and said, how can that possibly relate to Christmas? The man replied, they're carols. Just a bit of silliness this morning, but it does show the superficial way in which Christmas is proclaimed today. The essence of Christmas has nothing to do with candles or bells or even Christmas carols. I think it's easier for an increasingly secular society to address the holiday which celebrates Christ's birth by avoiding any message of Christ's birth in the celebration and to concentrate instead on the superficial. I've been watching some of Hallmark's Christmas movies in this season, and I've seen the messages in those movies. I've seen in them the need to believe in Christmas magic, a time in which anything is possible. Others tell us of the need to believe in Santa Claus. And still others emphasize the Christmas spirit in decorations or Christmas baked goods or Christmas music. But one thing that is glaringly absent in those movies, and that is the birth of the baby whose day we're supposed to be celebrating. Now, I don't blame Hallmark. It's easier to peddle nostalgia and fairy tales than to deal with the fallout that would come if they actually were celebrating the coming of Christ. But the trimmings mean nothing other than a warm feeling. The power of Christmas is in the intervention of God by the coming of his Son to bring us the salvation we so desperately needed. We see that theme this morning mirrored in a victory of Saul in our text as we continue taking our messages from 1 Samuel. This morning, 1 Samuel 11, verses 1 through 11. 1 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. Now Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, I will make it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel. The elders of Jabesh said to him, let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you. Then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep? And so they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen." Then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. They said to the messengers who had come, "Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance." So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Then the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." The next morning Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. I want you to see, first of all, in our text today, an enemy. As we come to our text, we see Nahash, the Ammonite, besieging the town of Jabesh Gilead. You might remember that one of the reasons why Israel wanted a king was due to the powerful nations around them, against which they felt helpless. The kingdom of Ammon was one of those powerful enemies. Ammon's kingdom bordered Israel on the northeast side. The town of Jabesh, where this takes place, was east of the Jordan River in the northern part of Israel, meaning it was very close to the invading enemy. So when they were besieged by the enemy, Jabesh, this town, was not strong enough to resist because the enemy was too strong for them. They had no hope unless the rest of Israel rallied to their defense. And Israel had not come and rallied to the defense of its outlying towns for a while now. And even if Israel came together, they didn't have much hope of escaping the wrath of this horrible enemy. And that's why they pleaded with Nahash to make peace with them. They even offered to make themselves his servants if he would let them have peace. But we find out here in our text this morning, it wasn't just that the enemy was too strong. It's also that the enemy was too cruel. Nahash wasn't content to merely make them his servants. He wanted to humiliate them. He wanted to hurt them. He wanted to defile them, that he would show his contempt for Israel in doing so. He insisted that they could only have peace as his servants if they would allow him to gouge out the right eye of every one of them. Like poor Jabesh, we find ourselves to be besieged by a wicked enemy. The enemy is sin. We find ourselves in this horrible predicament because we've been living too close to sin. That's the truth. We've been living so near to sin that sin became a problem in our lives. And sin has surrounded us, and it threatens to destroy us. And it is too powerful for us. Everyone who finds themselves in sin's grasp finds out that they have no ability to rid themselves of it and the death that it would bring. Even worse, not only is sin too powerful, but it's too cruel a master. It's not satisfied with making us its slave. It wants to inflict misery and ruin on our lives. It wants to disfigure us and fill our lives with pain, to toy maliciously with us before it destroys us altogether. Secondly, in our text this morning, I'd like for you to see that we have a deliverer. In the time of Jabesh's great need, God had placed Saul on the throne as their leader. Now, it's interesting that Saul, the new king here, was spending his time with the livestock. He was coming in from the fields behind a pair of oxen at the time that he heard of this happening. In other words, I don't think Saul was too comfortable with the royal life. It was easier for him to return to his roots where he normally lived on the farm. But that changed when the threat was made known to him. And then Saul met the threat head on. At hearing of Jabesh's peril, the Spirit of God came upon him. That's significant there. You know, we could read right past those words in our passage, maybe not notice that. But this is what our passage says. The Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of God came upon him on hearing this. It was that Spirit in him which enabled him for the task that was his to do. The Spirit in him produced a righteous wrath. It made him angry that the enemies of God had come against God's people. And the Spirit thus moved him, making him to act radically and with determination. He chopped up his oxen, and he sent them by messenger, the butchered remains of them, throughout the kingdom, with the threat that anyone who did not respond to come out and defend Jabesh would have his oxen chopped up in the same way. It was an unexpected and unusual approach to raising an army, but it worked. And in this way, 300,000 men were rallied to the fight where no one had been willing to stand before. 300,000 men as Israel came out as one person to meet the enemy, because Saul, by the Spirit of God, had rallied them. And so a deliverer was raised up by the Spirit of God on Saul, the man whom God had chosen for this very task. Now I want you to think for a moment about that righteous wrath that came upon Saul as an evidence of the Spirit. We who belong to the Lord today are to have his Spirit living in us. Know this, that the Spirit indwelling us will not allow us to be indifferent to the presence of wrong. If we are living by the Spirit, we won't be bystanders while evil does its work. We must have within our hearts a righteous indignation, a holy wrath, if you will, against that which harms others. And again, with the indwelling Spirit, we're called to live lives radically and with determination to do what God would have us to do. We can't just plod along with our heads down, walking in the old ruts as if there was nothing that we could do. As Paul said of the Spirit-driven conviction that was upon him in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. So by the Spirit we are compelled to act with conviction in the way that God would have us to. Now when we see God raising up a deliverer in Old Testament Israel, Saul, to fight against those who would attack his people, So we find in the New Testament, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, sent him to deliver us from the foe too great and too cruel for us. Jesus met the threat head on. The coming of the Christ that we celebrate this season had its purpose in the cross of Jesus. Jesus came to deliver us. And there on that cross, he used a slaughter in an unusual and unexpected way to address that which oppressed men most of all. He gave his body as a bloody sacrifice, as a means to fight. The people of Israel were expecting a deliverer in the Messiah to free them from Rome's oppression. But God sent a deliverer to address the death grasp of sin, which was dragging us down to eternal destruction. People still, today want a different kind of Savior than the one that came by God. Many in the modern church want to make Jesus' ministry more about practical issues, like finding purpose in one's work, or insights for conflict resolution, or 1,000 other topical themes that are going to help us in living our daily lives in this world. Many others want Jesus to be a social warrior, addressing political issues and social programs. And there are those who want the Christ to deliver them from their own insecurity and make them feel better about themselves, just as they are. Take away the guilt by saying that they are perfectly acceptable in the way that they are living their lives. But none of these things matter a whit in comparison to the foe that Jesus came to deliver us from. His salvation doesn't make us more comfortable for the moment. It deals with our eternal fate. And that gospel message that so many would say is old and stale is in fact the one message that man needs to hear in this age as well as in every other age. It doesn't matter if your feelings are hurt because others don't appreciate you enough. It doesn't matter if the job you do to get the money to pay your way is not fulfilling. It doesn't matter if all the political issues go in the way that we think they should, or even if we live under the heavy thumb of an oppressive government. The only thing that matters in the long run is whether we will be his for all time and in eternity see how meaningless those temporary things were, or whether we will be dragged down to eternal sorrow and regret apart from him. One other thing I wanted you to see in our text this morning, and that is the victory. The victory that was established by Saul wasn't just by a narrow margin. Saul did not win it in overtime with a field goal. No, he was overwhelmingly victorious. Saul divided his men into 3 companies and sent them against the camp of the mighty Ammonites in the morning watch. And before the heat of the afternoon, the rout of the enemy had become complete, so that most of the Ammonites were killed, and of the few that were able to flee, not even 2 of them were running in the same direction. I mean, this that had been the well-organized army of Ammon was reduced to nothing in this conflict by the deliverer that God raised up in Saul. And so Jabesh was resoundingly delivered. The victory that Jesus won for us on that cruel cross was even more thorough than that. Those who receive him have their sins destroyed completely, so that not even the tiniest fragment of those sins remain. And as those delivered, we have a home with the Lord. Freed from the pain and destruction of sin, we live lives exceedingly victorious for him in this world. And when we leave this world behind, we'll see how complete that victory is as we live with him in his eternal home. In conclusion this morning, in Christmas, we find the promise of deliverance. John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. I want you to notice that passage is written in what John has to say about the Word, Jesus Christ, coming into the world. It really is a Christmas message there in John, the first chapter. In 12 and 13, he writes, "But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." We experience that deliverance in this world. But we have not seen the whole of his victory in this world, nor will we until someday we cross the threshold. Still, we hold what we are going to attain as a certainty. Do you remember in our text that the people of Jabesh had received word by messengers the day before the battle of their deliverance that Israel had rallied and that they were going to be free by tomorrow afternoon? Do you remember what they did? They rejoiced. They celebrated. They held as a certainty that victory that they had not yet seen with their own eyes. But the word of what was in store for them made them glad. Brothers and sisters, we haven't seen our heavenly home yet, but that's the promise of this complete victory. And we hold it as a certainty because of the one who promised it. We hold as a certainty the promise of Christmas, that we will be with him forever. So our invitation this morning is simply this: will you receive the promise of Christmas today, this morning?